the world has never been a stranger to cruelty. When we look back at history, the past does not greet us with gentle memories. It opens its doors with blood, tears, and the cries of those who suffered under power. Among the countless stories of brutality, one tale emerges like a wound carved deep into the flesh of time: the story of Emperor Valerian, the only Roman emperor to be captured alive by a foreign enemy and subjected to one of the most humiliating and savage punishments ever known to humankind. Valerian was not just any man. He was Rome's emperor, ruler of the world's greatest empire in the 3rd century. To his people, he was power embodied, a man clothed in purple robes, crowned with authority, and surrounded by the might of armies and legions. To the rest of the known world, Rome was the iron fist that crushed nations, enslaved the weak, and spread fear wherever its eagle banner flew. Yet even the strongest empire carries within it the seed of weakness. And in Valerian's story, we see how fragile power truly is, how easily dignity can be stripped away, and how swiftly the mighty can be reduced to flesh, bone, and shame. The 3rd century was not a golden age for Rome. It was a time of crisis, a century of chaos. Emperors rose and fell like waves in a storm. Armies mutinied, borders collapsed, and plague devoured whole populations. In this storm, Valerian rose to power in 253 CE, an old man by Roman standards, chosen for his experience and stability. He was not young, not fiery with ambition, but he was steady, and Rome desperately needed steadiness. He shared power with his son Gallienus, hoping to protect the empire from its enemies, both within and without. But Rome's greatest enemy at the time was not within Europe. It was in the east, in the rising Persian Empire under its new and ambitious ruler. Shapur I. To the Persians, Rome was not invincible. To them, Rome was a wounded beast staggering in the desert, a prize waiting to be taken. And Shapur, fierce, intelligent, and merciless, intended to take it. The wars between Rome and Persia were brutal. Cities burned, bodies were left unburied, and slaves were dragged in chains to foreign lands. Valerian himself led armies to the east to meet Shapur on the battlefield, determined to defend Roman honor. But Rome's soldiers were weary, their numbers thinned by plague and betrayal. When the two forces clashed near Edessa in 260 CE, fate dealt Valerian the cruelest hand imaginable. His army was crushed, his men slaughtered, and Rome's emperor himself was captured alive. It is here that Valerian's story takes its darkest turn. For in most wars, when kings and generals were captured, they might be ransomed, exchanged, or imprisoned. But Shapur had no intention of giving back Rome's emperor. He had captured the man who symbolized Rome itself, and with this prisoner, he would humiliate not just one man, but an entire empire. Imagine the sight: Valerian, emperor of Rome, once seated on golden thrones, now dragged in chains before Shapur. His royal robes torn, his dignity stripped, his body beaten. Shapur forced him to bow. Not to gods, not to Rome, but to Persia's might. And the humiliation did not end there. Ancient accounts tell us that Shapur used Valerian as a living stool. Whenever Shapur mounted his horse, Valerian was forced to kneel, his back bent, so that the Persian king could step upon him like a piece of furniture. The ruler of the greatest empire in the world reduced to nothing more than a step for another man's boot. This was not just cruelty, it was a message. It was the deliberate stripping of a man's humanity, a performance of domination meant to echo across the world. For centuries, Rome had enslaved others, forced men and women to bow, to suffer indignity, to carry chains. Now, for once, Rome's emperor tasted the same humiliation that Rome had inflicted upon millions. And yet, as terrible as this was, Valerian's story grew darker still. The accounts differ, but all of them speak of a death so horrifying it almost sounds like myth. Shapur did not simply kill Valerian, he ended his life in a way that carved his name into the blackest corners of history. Some say Shapur poured molten gold down Valerian's throat. Others whisper that he was flayed alive, his skin stripped from his body while his flesh still trembled with pain. Ancient historians claim his skin was then stuffed with straw, preserved as a trophy, and displayed in Persian temples for generations to see. A reminder that even emperors bleed, that even kings can be skinned like animals. Their pride stretched out like parchment for the world's amusement. Think of the image, an emperor's skin, emptied of life, hanging as a trophy of conquest. A man reduced to leather. The purple robes of Rome replaced by the grotesque garment of his own flesh. That is the fate that befell Valerian, the emperor who was skinned alive. But behind this cruelty lies a deeper truth. Power does not make a man immortal. Status does not protect one from humiliation. Rome had enslaved millions, but here, Rome's emperor became the slave of his enemy. Rome had stripped dignity from countless others, but here, Rome's leader was stripped of his own. There is a haunting justice in this reversal. Though it came not from compassion or righteousness, but from cruelty answering cruelty. When we tell Valerian's story, we are not just speaking of one emperor's downfall. We are speaking of the fragility of human dignity when placed in the hands of power. We are speaking of how domination breeds cycles of suffering, how humiliation echoes across centuries. We are reminded that the very things Rome once inflicted on others returned to devour Rome itself. And yet, in Valerian's suffering, we also see a mirror of the countless nameless lives history has silenced. How many men and women throughout the ages were forced to kneel as steps for another's pride? How many were stripped of dignity, flayed not in flesh but in spirit, their humanity reduced to trophies of conquest? Valerian's story is remembered because he was an emperor, but his humiliation is not unique. It is the story of slaves, the story of the conquered, the story of anyone who has ever had their humanity denied. This is why Valerian's fate still echoes today. It is more than just a tale of one man's gruesome death. It is a parable about the corruption of power, the fragility of pride, and the cruelty of domination. It is a reminder that history does not only remember victories, but also the brutal costs of arrogance. As we stand before this story, we cannot help but feel a chill, for Valerian's fall was not just his on it, was Rome's, and in his broken body, in his flayed skin, in his humiliation beneath Shapur's boots, we see the truth of empire itself. No throne lasts forever, no power stands unchallenged, and every empire, no matter how mighty, must one day kneel. The death of Valerian did not end with his body. It lived on as a wound in the heart of Rome, a scar that no victory could heal. Imagine the whispers spreading across the empire when news arrived that the emperor, the man who was supposed to be the living embodiment of Roman power, was not simply defeated, not simply killed, but captured, humiliated, and destroyed in the most degrading manner known to man. Rome, which had once believed itself eternal, invincible, destined by the gods to rule all nations, now had to swallow the bitter truth that its ruler had been turned into a spectacle of suffering. For his son Gallienus, the humiliation was unbearable. He inherited not just the throne but the shame. To the Roman people, their empire had been stained. To their enemies, Rome's weakness had been exposed. For centuries, Roman emperors had been gods in the eyes of their people. Their images carved into marble, their faces stamped into coins. Now one of those gods had been broken like clay, stripped of dignity, reduced to a grotesque display in the temples of Persia. The symbolism was devastating. When Shapur displayed Valerian's flayed skin, it was more than cruelty, was a declaration that Rome itself could be skinned. Rome itself could be hollowed out. Rome itself could be stuffed like straw. For every Roman who heard the tale, the shame was suffocating. And for every Persian who saw the trophy, the lesson was clear. The mighty are not immune to humiliation. But Valerian's suffering did not vanish with time. His end became a ghost that haunted the empire. Rome, already struggling with internal chaos, would spend decades clawing its way back from the humiliation. Armies mutinied, provinces broke away, and the empire fractured into pieces. While Valerian's son Gallienus fought desperately to hold onto the remnants of power, the shadow of Valerian's fate loomed over him. Every enemy, every rival, every citizen knew that Rome's emperor had once been forced to kneel as a stool beneath another man's boot. That memory could not be erased. Yet, for all its horror, Valerian's story is more than just a chapter in Rome's decline. It is a mirror reflecting truths that echo far beyond the walls of Rome. Truths that touch every people who have known the bitterness of oppression. For what Shapur did to Valerian was not unique in spirit. It was the same cruelty that empires inflict when they strip others of their dignity. Think of the millions Rome enslaved men torn from their homelands, women dragged into servitude, children raised in chains. To Rome, they were trophies of conquest, bodies to be used, voices to be silenced. They were paraded in triumphs, displayed as proof of Rome's power, stripped of humanity and turned into living ornaments of victory. Was that not the same cruelty Shapur inflicted on Valerian? To make him a spectacle, to turn his suffering into proof of Persian greatness. The roles were reversed, but the cruelty was the same. This is the haunting justice of history, that the oppressor often becomes the oppressed, that the hands which enslave may one day wear chains. Valerian was an emperor, and his humiliation shocked the world because emperors were not supposed to suffer like slaves. Yet his story only proves that power is a mask, not a shield. Strip away the crown, and even the ruler of Rome is only flesh and bone, vulnerable to the same pain, the same indignities, the same humiliations as those he once ruled. And so Valerian's story speaks not just of his downfall, but of the universal human hunger for dignity. Dignity is not gold, not power, not empire. It is the simple recognition that one's humanity cannot be trampled underfoot. But history shows us again and again how fragile dignity becomes when power is unbalanced. Those who have power strip it away from others. Those without power cling to it desperately. And when vengeance comes, it often repeats the same cruelty it seeks to avenge. The image of Valerian's skin, preserved like parchment, is more than grotesque. It is symbolic. It tells us that when cruelty rules, what is left of a man is not his spirit, not his story, not his humanity, but a hollowed-out shell. It is the warning of empire itself. When domination is built on humiliation, it leaves behind only emptiness. Yet, even in this darkness, we can draw lessons. For Valerian's suffering, brutal and undeserved, forces us to confront our own world. How many today are still treated as less than human? How many are forced to kneel, to bow, to live with their dignity stripped away? The forms may be different: chains replaced by poverty, humiliation replaced by systemic injustice. But the essence remains the same. Valerian's fall is not just ancient history. It is a parable of every society that forgets the humanity of those it rules. And perhaps this is why his story still resonates, even after 17 centuries. Because in the flayed skin of an emperor, we see the truth that no one is untouchable, that power without justice is hollow, and that cruelty devours not only the victim but the one who inflicts it. Shapur may have triumphed in his day, but his victory was one of brutality, not honor. Rome may have enslaved millions, but in the end, its own emperor became the slave of another. This is the cycle that history whispers to us, again and again. Dignity denied will always return as dignity destroyed. As we close Valerian's story, let us not see it as only the tale of one man's humiliation, but as the testimony of what happens when human beings forget compassion. Valerian's broken body, his skin displayed as a trophy, his humiliation beneath the boots of another, remind us that empire is fragile, power is fleeting, and cruelty leaves scars deeper than any victory. But more than that, it calls us to look beyond the emperor himself. For if we remember Valerian's pain, we must also remember the countless nameless lives who suffered the same, whose skin was not preserved as trophies but buried in silence, whose voices were erased, whose dignity was stripped without history's recognition. Their stories are the invisible echo beneath Valerian's. In remembering him, we must remember them. For the lesson of Valerian is not only that even emperors can be humiliated, but that no human being should ever be. His fate warns us that cruelty does not discriminate, devours the high and the low alike. And only by honoring dignity, by refusing to step upon another's back, by rejecting the spectacle of humiliation, can we break the cycle that history has repeated for millennia. The emperor who was skinned alive was more than a Roman ruler who met a grotesque fate. He was the embodiment of empire's weakness, the symbol of power's fragility, and the reminder of humanity's endless thirst for dignity. His story is not one of glory, but of warning. It tells us that the true strength of a people, a nation, an empire, is not measured in conquest or humiliation, but in justice, in compassion, in the recognition that every life, whether emperor or slave, deserves dignity. And so, when we remember Valerian, let us not remember only his humiliation. Let us remember the lesson it carved into history, that cruelty leaves nothing behind but hollow skins, and that only dignity gives meaning to human life.